Hi, I'm Mattanah DeWitt, joined by Dr. Luke Bray. Welcome to Discover Your Roots, a podcast that will give you the tools for understanding and applying the wisdom of the Bible in your own context. In Season 3, we're focusing on Christian advocacy. We're trying to understand how Christian theology shapes what or who we advocate for, why we advocate, and how we advocate. As sin causes our world to become increasingly more divided, our society has moved from worshiping God to worshiping self. Christians need to understand how to combat division with unity. How should Christians advocate for others? What do the teachings of the Bible have to say about advocacy? How should Christians advocate for the Jewish community amidst rising anti-Semitism? We're unpacking all of this in Season 3 of Discover Your Roots. Welcome, everyone, to Episode 9 of the Discover Your Roots podcast. Season I almost said Season 4. Not yet. We're still on Season 3, where we are talking about Christian advocacy, what it means to be an advocate, a faithful advocate, faith-filled, faith-motivated advocate. This episode, we're going to be talking about empowerment. So the aspect of advocacy that actually looks like coming alongside others to empower them, not just, we don't want to do advocacy in a way that is condescending or that makes us out to be the hero. We want to do advocacy in a way that actually empowers others. It doesn't make us the center of the attention, but it actually empowers others. So we're going to be exploring what that looks like. We're going to be kind of diving into some ways that this looks whenever it's done right, and then some ways that this looks whenever it's maybe not done right. Mm-hmm. So we can actually kind of make out what should we do in this area. I really appreciate Dr. Luke Bray, who is still with us along the journey for this season. He has a lot of expertise and experience in the area of the history of Christian missions, also your intercultural experience. You just have a wealth of knowledge and wisdom to share with us in this particular topic. So I'm excited for us to dive in. As usual, we offer a couple questions at the beginning just to help anchor our conversation. So those 3 questions are as follows. Number 1, we're asking the question, what is empowerment and why is it important? Number 2, we're asking, what is a history of Christian advocacy, especially in the contexts like the Middle East? And then number 3, we're asking the question, how does the goal of empowerment shape Christian advocacy? So to start us off, Luke, you wrote a paper for Passages, actually, on a Christian theology of advocacy. In that paper, you argue that Christians need to think about how to empower others with our advocacy. Can you briefly define empowerment and summarize that argument for us?
Sure. So I think as Christians, we're called to stand up for the marginalized, and we're to help them speak for themselves. I think we've talked about that over the last couple of episodes. We're commanded to care about the things that God cares about and the people that God cares about. So we see that in a couple of different places that we've talked about. One in particular is from Galatians 6. Paul is highlighting the importance of what it means for us to share burdens. Literally, he says, bear one another's burdens. So we're picking up the heavy things in other people's lives and we're carrying them alongside them. We're also supposed to be empathizing with the hurting, so much so that, we weep with those who weep. We're mourning when those around us are mourning. We have compassion that goes beyond just sharing an emotional pain or sorrow, but comes to bear in like a physical world through action and through service. So Proverbs 31, 8 and 9 urges us as advocates, we want to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. So we're defending the vulnerable, the poor, the needy. Christian solidarity involves entering into the lived experiences of other people and sharing in their struggles, not just as outsiders, but like really intimately being involved, supporting them in the pursuit of justice and wholeness. So when we attempt to help empower those who are in need, we do so by providing tools, by helping with education, by also helping them find opportunity so that as they are marginalized, we want to help bring them into a greater state of flourishing in their life. That's what we want to do when it comes to empowerment.
Mm. So in a moment, I want to set us up to study the history of Christian advocacy or outreach in a context you're familiar with, which is the Middle East. So would you mind just sharing with our audience how you developed such an interest in this region?
Sure. I many years ago served as a soldier and was deployed to Iraq, and that was the first time I had any kind of cross-cultural experience. I grew up in Missouri primarily, never had gone anywhere overseas, and so when I went to Iraq, my encounter there was so interesting to me because not only was the climate different and the culture different, but like the people were different. They had a different way of life. They had a different way of thinking about God, and their religious perspective, their culture, their language, all was very, very different from my own. And what I think I learned from that experience was one, uh, there's differences from people around the world, and it gave me a compassion for them and their life and what they're experiencing, especially at that point in war, but also a deep love for people in the Middle East. And so when I returned, I knew that I wanted to pursue that part of the world in some way. And so I began kind of walking into a path of education and did studies in Islamic studies and Middle Eastern history and Christian missions and eventually world religions. And so all of that kind of study and life, and then, in my own personal life, attempting to meet with Muslims or meet with new friends that were from Pakistan or that were from Iraq or other places in the Middle East. It was really helpful because I was able to not just talk with them, but build friendships with them so that I could share the love of Jesus with them. So anyway, that's kind of the story of the arc of my life coming into this area of interest.
Thank you for that. So with that context kind of on your background, let's talk about the Middle East now. So as we do, I also want to encourage our listeners to think about what we can learn from this example. At the end, I'll ask you to share a few takeaways too, Luke. So can you give us a brief history of Christian missions in the Middle East? No big deal.
Yeah.
Just tell us the history.
How much
of it
time
all.
do we have for this particular episode? Okay. Well, I think I would argue we need to understand how the region itself has evolved in order to really get a good picture of like how Christians have interacted in that space over the last couple of hundred years. The Arab world prior to the 17th century was a very interesting place. Arab world was robust, and it was potentially the heir to modernity. Like they had a lot of things going for them, whether it was literature or mathematics, all kinds of things. But decline really in that region of the world was attributed, when you look back at it from a historical perspective, was attributed to political misrule oftentimes, which led to economic stagnation, and so many times Islam's resistance to I got modern innovation sometimes, and some would say that's not true, or maybe you would say maybe reason, things like that, modern forms of reason. But nevertheless, we saw this kind of stagnation take place, which resulted in kind of a socially coherent but stagnant civilization in the Middle East under the rule of Islam. In the 19th century, the Western world advanced very rapidly after the kind of the Industrial Revolution kind of took on some technological advancements, and then the economies changed and the politics continued to change, and there's a lot of different features to this, some good, some really bad, but the Middle East itself faced this political instability, economic insecurities, and then as a result even religious tensions within the different tribal areas and groups. The Middle East tried to maintain religious fundamentals while associating with the rising secular West, but it was very difficult for them to hold those tensions together. And so this perpetuated a long time cycle of conflict between East and West. There's a 1,500-year history of conflict between the West and the East. Western changes linked to the Enlightenment, and like I said, the Industrial Revolution changed the dynamics and changed the kind of the power in the dynamics between those two regions of the world.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Could you share what impact exactly did the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution have?
Yeah. The Age of Reason that altered the Western worldview is pretty significant. It was displacement of religious authority. You began seeing like a disconnect between logic, reason, and intellectual freedom from religious faith, and instead there was an introduction of the scientific method and kind of a new way of understanding the world, a new cosmology, and this shifted from ecclesiastical authority or church authority to now scientific provability. So you begin to see this real kind of division happening in the West between science and faith, which doesn't have to be there, but nevertheless continue to occur.
Maybe representing what we might hear someone say now of, I don't believe in God, I believe in science.
Right, exactly. And that was born out of the Enlightenment era, that kind of way of understanding the world and having to have your categories divided in what could be proven and what could not be proven or something like that. The Enlightenment's impact on anthropology and human capabilities was very, very strong. Out of the Enlightenment was born kind of this idea of humanism, secular humanism. So everything that matters in the world is really focused in on us, and there's no metaphysical world, there's no real God, there's no creator. It's all about human ingenuity and innovation, and it's basically a neglect or a refusal to acknowledge that God does exist and that God is important. And so humans replaced God basically in the equation of what it matters in the world. So the Enlightenment had a really strong effect. The Industrial Revolution also pushed toward imperial expansion from the West. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, you have this shift from rural agricultural societies to industrial urban societies. So people began living in towns, and the towns began to get bigger, and the cities began to get bigger, and the infrastructure of the cities began to get bigger. And then the types of factories and all these different technologies that were kind of pouring into this industrial revolution began to erupt. And Europe and America, they gained global economic superiority as a result of so much of this technological boom in the Industrial Revolution. And so as a result, Europe spread its influence and did so through trade and what would later be known as colonization. They have colonies. They're taking the resources from these colonies, using them as they need to expand the power and authority of the empire. So tensions, and this wasn't an uncommon way of doing things. For thousands of years, this is the way that empires have kind of gone about their way in the world. Doesn't necessarily make it right, but it's not like it was unusual. It was just now there's like this pairing between technological advancement and the expansion of an empire, which happened really quickly. So that was one of the differences there. So the tensions between Western and Eastern or Near Eastern diplomacy and politics intensified. So it became much more polemic between these two groups of people. Their worldviews were different. Their understanding of God or science was different, and their appreciation for even the ideas of individualism versus collective kind of community sensibilities was different. So a lot of changes.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. You've talked about this a little bit, but what was going on politically at that time? Like, a lot of these changes were happening in innovation and, different ways of seeing the world, different ways of understanding what was true. What was happening politically?
There was a sharp decline of Eastern empires. So when you think about the Ottoman Empire and the Persians versus the rise of Western empires, you had Russia and Britain and France and Europe and the Western powers were seeking land, and the land was then able to give them commerce, whether it was through resource mining or you know, agriculture or something like that. But they were wanting to control these different areas, one of them being the Middle East. Britain's strategy was to maintain control by propping up um, Islamic leadership and opposing Russian expansion. It's one of the reasons that after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the way they set up these different mandate states created kind of a buffer with Russia. The Brits used the French as their buffer so that Russia wasn't as close to their mandate states as they were to the French. So,
Classic.
yeah, classic. Yeah. So anyway, they were very focused on that kind of work. So British reforms also scandalized the traditional Muslims, leading to internal cultural conflict. The way that their worldview operated was very different from that of the Muslim world. And the sad thing, I think, is missionaries who had good intentions, and I don't think that we don't want to deny that they had very big hearts. They loved people, but they rode on the curtails of this kind of imperial expansion, and much of I think the tone and the effect was felt in their missionary enterprises, kind of riding in with that colonialization. So missionaries became seen as agents of Western cultural imperialism, and furthering Western political and economic influence. That was kind of what was believed what was happening. And so there was a suspicion that arose with these missionaries who had good intentions, and some of them had less than good intentions, or they were a mixture, but like they wanted to help people. They viewed the missionaries as kind of this colonial expansion, in a way that they could oftentimes expand the values of the Western world into the Muslim world. So as a result, you have this crazy cultural conflict that rises between the missionaries and the Middle Eastern societies, because they don't agree. They don't want that. So
it's really interesting. Yeah. So thinking about that, let's talk a little bit more about Christian missions or activity in the Middle East. And just as a quick reminder, not all advocacy is going to look like necessarily missionary work.
No, of course.
That's not a blanket statement, but we can look back in history at some of the missionary work that was done in the Middle East in particular, kind of look at it and figure out, okay, what went well about this and what maybe didn't go so well about this, and we can learn from it. So, so Luke, what would you say was historically the essential strategy of Christian missionaries who were going into the Middle East?
Yeah, the strategy had a lot to do with helping the local church, actually. So when they went into these regions, the ultimate goal was Muslim evangelism. They wanted Muslims to hear the gospel, to know Jesus. But missionaries initially focused on not going into the Muslim communities, but instead revitalizing the Orthodox Christian communities, kind of as a prerequisite for broader missionary success. They thought that if they could awaken the Christian communities and build them up and support them in kind of reaching out to their Muslim neighbors, maybe that would have a greater effect. And so in the latter part of the 19th century, multiple missions agencies, including the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which is the ABCFM, they love their
hefty acronym.
Yeah, very hefty. They focused on evangelizing the Middle East, particularly among Nestorians in Eastern Anatolia, or Eastern Turkey, and Northern Iraq. And Nestorians, we could spend a lot of time talking about them. They're a Christian community that still exists today, but their theology is a little bit different from, say, the Orthodox. Anyway, we could spend a lot of time talking about just the nuance of that. But their founder, the person that kind of they get their name from, Nestorius, was the Bishop of Constantinople in the early period of the church. and so they hail from him, and some of the problems that arose in 431 at the Council of Ephesus, that is kind of where they divide from the rest of the Orthodox Church and have some disagreements there about the nature of Jesus, the incarnation. So there's conversations about that. Nevertheless, they're there. So the ABCFM was probably the most influential agency, and though it encountered resistance and cultural clashes with the Ottoman Empire, but they were the most, I guess, sizable organization moving in that region at the time. Missionaries aimed to revive the Orthodox churches in the Middle East so that they could more effectively reach the Muslims. They believed that the locals could probably share the gospel better. They understood the language better. They spoke it. It was their language. They understood the cultural differences better than the foreign missionaries. And so they were wanting to try and help them be able to accomplish that. And there was a perceived need to address the spiritual decline in the Middle Eastern, I say, quote unquote, heterodox churches. So the churches
Can you define that for us?
Heterodox, like I said, in 431, Nestorius was excommunicated because he believed, it's a little bit dicey to get into it, but the difference between the nature of Jesus. So is there one nature, two natures? Very kind of a complicated thinking about this how Jesus is both God and man. So he has two natures, but he's one person. Okay. So there was disagreements between Nestorius, who was the bishop of Constantinople, and Cyril of Alexandria. He was the bishop there. And so their conversation was not really helpful. And they eventually had a big kind of disagreement and debate about it. And in 431, they met in Ephesus for this discussion. And at the time, things are very political. Nestorius loses. A lot of his people couldn't show up because of a storm, and eventually he gets the vote and he's excommunicated. Goes and lives the rest of his days out by the Black Sea, and writes his final work, the Bazaar of Heraclitus. And so people that believed him and kind of followed his understanding of how Jesus is two natures but one person, they are kind of outed as being heterodox.
Okay.
And there's disagreements about what they believed then versus what they believe now, and is that truly heterodox or is it not? So there's a lot of conversation still about that. But the point was, these Christian missionaries believed that if they could kind of they could minister to these Christians, even though they're heterodox from them, they disagree with some very fine points of doctrine, maybe they could inspire them to reach their Muslim neighbors, because they already have the cultural toolkit and language toolkit to actually do it, but maybe they just don't have the inspiration to do it. So missionaries launched a strategic experiment focused on reviving these Christian communities, because they saw revitalization to these ancient Christian communities as essential to the strategy for converting Muslims. So this approach became kind of the guiding strategy for missionary work in Turkey, Arabia, and Persia. And the hope was that they could rekindle a missionary zeal for the churches that were already there, like the Nestorian church, which had historically spread Christianity far and wide. From the very early period in the 400s or 500s, like the Nestorians were taking, there's records of the Nestorian church taking the gospel as far as India and China, which is very early on in the missionary movements, to take it that far. So anyway.
So before I ask you whether you agree with the strategy or not, what were some of the challenges that the strategy presented?
Well, many of the challenges were cultural and religious in nature. Over time, these Christian communities had become isolated and degraded under Islamic domination. They didn't have as much courage in the face of it. Now they were a little bit weakened by that. And that led to kind of a loss of missionary impulse. They were just kind of like wanting to just get by, wanting to protect their own. There was a lot of isolationism as a result. So, the what has been called the dhimmi syndrome, dhimmis, the dhimitude is the basically the taxation of peoples of the book. So, like people that were non-Muslims but lived in Muslim regions, um, they would be asked to pay jizya tax, a tax, so that to the Muslim community for protection. But
So
it was
basically,
basically a second class
mafia
student. Yeah,
kind of.
it's kind
Yeah.
of like a, pay us so we don't burn down your pizza parlor. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
so it's a way of dominating the marginalized community, taking away their rights. And then sometimes it would get so bad as they would make them wear particular things, particular colors that would signify them as non-Muslims.
Mm.
And so it was very, very kind of dehumanizing and alienating among those communities. One author, Bat Yor, describes the long-term effects upon non-Muslim people in the Middle East with this concept of the dhimmi syndrome. She says 12 centuries of humiliation impressed upon the individual and collective psychologies of the oppressed groups, a common form of alienation, the dhimmi syndrome. On the individual level, it was characterized by a profound dehumanization.
Mm.
The individual resigned to a passive existence, developed a feeling of helplessness and vulnerability, the consequence of a condition of permanent insecurity, servility and ignorance, humility and discriminated against. He projected onto his group a scornful, accusatory, self-destructive, and self-destructive hatred whose intensity varied in accordance with the extent of his desire to assimilate into the majority. So it's a
Oh,
very,
that's
like,
so sad.
centuries and centuries of this kind of pressure to assimilate, pressure to not be the nail that's sticking up too far because that's the one that gets the hammer kind of thing. And so, like, you can imagine, like, the missionaries come into this and they're like, hey, why don't you be the nail that's sticking up and say something and be the change, right? And, like, that's not really well received,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Islam was viewed by some missionaries as being or stemming from a corrupted form of Christianity, like it had misunderstood or misguided version of Christianity. And so some Christian missionaries were looking at it that way. Some were wanting to lift up these marginalized communities. But for the missionaries that looked at Islam in this way, thought, we can reach them through these things. That's why they believe that restoring true piety to the Christian communities could maybe facilitate Muslim conversion. So if the Muslims who kind of have this corrupted version of faith in Christ could see the Christian communities for what they are, and we could bring them together, it's just like, wow, it's like, utopia. It could happen. I mean, that's what the belief was. So it drew this false equivalence between the ancient Orthodox churches in the Middle East and Islam, which was where you ended up, I think, finding a lot of the problems.
Man. So what ended up being the outcome whenever these missionaries would come in? It feels like it's kind of like a recipe for disaster they were talking about. A little bit of a
storm, yeah.
So what happened? And I mean, I would ask, was it effective? I think I probably know the answer. But yeah, like what happened as a result of all of that?
Yeah. By and large, I would argue that this approach to helping the people of the Middle East, both the Christian and the Muslim, probably failed. And I would say that there's maybe 5 reasons for that. The first one is ethnocentric attitudes. Ethnocentric is like thinking of yourself or your culture or your ethnicity as being primary and more important or superior to those around you. Missionaries carried a sense of that cultural superiority when they came into the Middle East. They equated Western values with Christian tenets. And when you do that, you kind of make a mess. The attitude led to a lack of appreciation for local cultures and reinforced anti-Christian sentiments in the region because of that ethnocentric attitude. The second is the missionaries' refusal to contextualize. And like in today's missionary methodologies, we understand the value of contextualization a little bit more clearly than missionaries in the 19th century. But missionaries insisted on imposing Western culture. So including like the way people dress, the educational content, the way people worship, where they worship, and all of that created this kind of cultural dissonance. Their failure to adapt to local customs and understandings led to alienation and misunderstandings. And I think one of those is exemplified by the story of Asiel Grant, his experience in Turkey. So,
what happened there?
So, Asiel Grant was a medical missionary among the Nestorians, like we were talking about, but he misunderstood the need to contextualize when he constructed a house, and it was in a deep and narrow valley in Turkey. And the Kurds in the south, they had heard of this newly built house and they were feeling very threatened by it. And it wasn't his plan. Grant didn't understand what was going on. He didn't understand why they would feel threatened by this. But the windows that he installed in his home were the very first windows in the region. So they didn't know what that was, how these windows were constructed. They didn't understand what they were. They felt threatened because they believed Grant was constructing some kind of fort. And he was going to, because of what he was doing with the Nestorians, he was raising a Nestorian Christian army to fight against the Kurds in the south. And so the Kurds, they mistook the building's windows for gun portals and used that as that controversy as one of the reasons that they used to justify the plundering of the Nestorian communities. So it was a really quick
that backfired
reaction.
in a really bad,
very much so,
very bad way.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's such a good reminder of, as good as our intentions are, if we don't understand the people and the context that we're trying to help.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking about this idea of empowerment. It's not just about what we have to offer, but we need to understand what's actually needed and how do we empower. Because if not, I'm sure he was probably devastated that was the result.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That was never the intent.
No.
But yet, if we don't do our homework in advance and like really understand who it is we're trying to help, and also make sure that it's about them being helped and not about us helping the way we want to help,
right,
it could cause a lot of damage.
It caused a lot of damage, and like it wasn't just damage for Grant, but like he harmed the communities that he was actually trying to help.
Oh,
so
sad.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we've got those first couple of things: ethnocentric attitudes, failure to contextualize. But then I would say number 3 would be disrespectful attitude toward Muslims, and we see this all the time. Missionaries often displayed like a scorn, and they used anti-Islamic rhetoric, alienating the very people they were trying to reach. When you use inflammatory language to like get a response,
we're not familiar with any of that.
Yeah,
today, are we?
No, we don't do that kind of thing in any of our political dialogue.
We've graduated beyond that.
We're so wise and discerning in the way that we speak to each other. No, when you do that, it almost never brings a person to your side of the conversation, right?
Yeah.
The kind of the quote unquote the crusader mentality just continued to distance missionaries from Muslims who already viewed them as an extension of Western colonialism. And so the way they spoke about them, the way they condescended to them, just further distanced them from actually being willing to listen to what they had to say about Jesus. So number 4, influence of liberal theology. We talked a little bit about this earlier on in the episodes. In the West, the shift toward liberalism led lots of missionaries to focus on social renewal rather than evangelism. And I think what I would argue is that both are necessary, not one or the other, but both. And so that diminished the spiritual urgency of the mission. So if it was just about social renewal, you could take more time. If it was about evangelism and like eternal life kind of issues, then a greater urgency was necessary to get the gospel to the people that had not heard. So the theological shift redefined missions as promoting Western civilization, like the culture and the values of the West, rather than addressing the issues of sin and salvation. And so the influence of liberal theology kind of helped tweak the missionary impulse a little bit, which made it a little less effective. But even when it was just straight evangelism, it was a little less effective too, because they were still doing some of the other things that were preventing them from having greater
Like
effect.
the not
You're
contextualizing.
not contextualizing,
Yeah.
thinking too highly of your own culture and ethnicity,
Yeah.
kind of, making the Muslim the enemy, that kind of
Mm.
stuff. The last one is alienation of Orthodox authorities. Missionaries sought to reform Orthodox communities, but their efforts were rejected by Orthodox clergy, which led to persecution and expulsion. They misunderstood. There was misunderstandings between missionaries and Orthodox Christians, who they expected political and military support, um, and so when they didn't get that, because they're marginalized, they're ostracized from their, the power grid in their communities, and so they're expecting the Western powers to come in and be like, "Hey, we'll give you a little bit of aid. Here's what's going to happen." But when that didn't happen through the hand of the missionaries, because the missionaries didn't have power to offer, they weren't like extensions of the political arm of the British Empire. They were just people there that maybe had skills in medicine or hospitalization, building hospitals or taking care of orphans and widows. So when they weren't able to offer them power or support in that way, it just further hindered their cooperation. They didn't want to. There was too much at risk for them, for the Orthodox communities.
Interesting. Well, the peoples of the Middle East have been through a lot, clearly.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of conflict, a lot of suffering, and I mean, even we see today a lot of the headlines that we see in the news. And at the time that we're recording this, it's true. And I imagine at the time that whoever's listening to this, it will probably still be true because this is just, it's been true for a long time. There's a lot of trauma, and that trauma only compounds over time. So as we think about having a perspective of Christian advocacy, how should Christians who want to help think about the challenges that the people of the Middle East have faced, and how are we being invited in this moment, having learned from the past, to be able to approach this better in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things we have to do is even though we've been talking about Christian missions. When we talk about advocacy, the principles here are really something that's going to help us in the long term when we try to help those that are in need. So, like, just to summarize those, like, if you want to be a good advocate for those who are hurting around you, don't think of yourself more highly than you should, right? Be humble.
Yeah.
Also, try to understand them. Don't assume you understand them. Ask them questions. Try to explore what it means to be in their shoes. Don't just assume you know exactly what they're feeling. So be willing to contextualize. And then also, don't be condescending in the way that you ask questions, or the way you make offers for support or help. Don't be disrespectful in that way. Be willing to learn. And then also make sure you keep a tight rein on why you're doing what you're doing. Because if you get twisted up and you're going because of social renewal and justice and all this, and it's unrelated to the gospel of the kingdom, it's unrelated to you walking in the way of Jesus, you're going to miss the motivating factor that sends you out into this work. It has to stay fixed to Jesus. And that way you don't alienate the very people that you're trying to help. So I think those are some of the key learnings that we get from this kind of discussion of Christian missions. Now, I think as we think about Christians and how we want to help, and what are we learning about this, there are a few things that we need to keep in mind. One is that we're very different in the West from those living in the Middle East. There is an kind of a reality that's called collective memory, and as a result, collective trauma. And those things are very much real. An entire society can react to a collective trauma, and sometimes it's in very extreme ways. And so Christian advocacy that is not sensitive to these realities can do more harm than good. So we have to be very careful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you explain a little bit more about that? What is collective memory? What is collective trauma?
Yeah. So social or collective memories are shaped by social, economic, and even sometimes political circumstances. They're shaped by beliefs or values, by experiences of opposition or resistance. They involve cultural norms, things that happen, and issues of like being real, authentic, um, issues related to identity and power. Social memory changes when time and or it changes over time. It changes over time, and it's sometimes kind of flexible. It's contingent on a lot of different things that are happening to a particular people group, and so a group's collective memory can be contested, even within their own group. It can be forgotten, it can be suppressed, it can be retrieved, but collective memory can even sometimes be rewritten. Um, when the group's narrative changes and edited like that. So individuals, we retain memories of past experiences, but it's within the social context that the interpretation of these individually shared memories shape the way that the group understands and recreates the past. So Maurice Holbach, um, he argues that even individual memory is bound to external social experiences. So this is what he says in a book on collective memory. He says, "It is in society that people normally acquire their memories. It's also in society that they recall, recognize, and localize their memories. Most of the time when I remember, it is others who spur me on. Their memory comes to the aid of mine, and mine relies on theirs. There's nothing mysterious about a recall of memories. There's no point in seeking where they are preserved in my brain or in some nook of my mind to which I alone have access, for they are recalled to me externally, and the groups of which I am a part of at any time give me the means to reconstruct them."
Wow.
So we're all kind of built in this thing together. We have a collective memory of the past, and like for you and I, we're Americans, so like we have a bit of a collective kind of impulse when it comes to things like, I don't know, when you think about 9/11 or something like that. There's a collective memory of things that have transpired. People older than us, maybe it's like, where were you when JFK was shot, something like that. But there's collective memory of events. But ours are oftentimes more focused on individual experiences because we live in kind of an individualistic society. People in the Middle East don't. They live in a collective society where being individual or unique is really not, it's more frowned upon than it is encouraged. Uniformity is more so encouraged. And so their memory is tighter as a collective group, which is why 1,000 years or however long it's been since the Crusades, they still talk about it because it's a part of their collective identity, and it's retained in that.
Wow. So how do communities usually respond to a trauma that they have experienced and then obviously still kind of remember together?
Yeah. A society's response to group trauma is probably best understood with 4 key reactions. The first one is suspicion. So the group has a suspicion toward those outside the boundaries of the particular people group.
So it automatically kind of makes the community a bit more insular.
Yes.
Because they're more aware of threats.
Yeah.
From the
And they're assuming that people are out to get them. So there's a suspicion.
Okay.
And then from that, there's solidarity within the community. So they unite as a community around a particular cause. Maybe that cause is protection, or maybe it's some sort of kind of religious ideology, whatever it might be. But then superiority, that kind of is the next step in it. Feeling superior to everyone else who would seek to oppress them or persecute them. They almost have to assume the superiority, even though they don't feel like they are. Basically, maybe they're the marginalized
place
ones.
of protection.
Yeah. And then significance. And that's finding the community has to find purpose, and it's shaped by the experience that they've had, leaving the social group with kind of this newfound sense and motivation for being. So like, who are we? Why do we do what we do? we stand here. This is what we do.
Mm.
So.
Yeah. Wow. That's really profound. And honestly, I think really shed some light on why it's so important for us to contextualize, why it's so important for us to be, even like the word gentleness. Like we've talked a lot about how Jesus came and met people where they were.
Yeah.
There was a gentleness to Jesus. And I think realizing that, especially in these groups of people that have experienced this collective trauma, we have to approach these contexts with gentleness and understanding, that there's a lot more going on than what we can't impose our own context on someone else, especially whenever there's that kind of trauma involved.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
What sort of lessons can we transfer from this conversation to the idea of Christian advocacy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think cultural sensitivity and contextualization, like we've spoken about, not just Western missionaries, but also Western humanitarian organizations often impose their own cultural norms on the Middle Eastern societies. And that leads to resistance, it leads to failure. So Christians, we have to prioritize cultural sensitivity. We have to respect the local traditions. We have to understand the values while compassionately serving and telling the story of Jesus in ways that resonate with the community, resonates with their historical and cultural context. So I think that's one. Another is empathy toward collective trauma. We want to have the same, I guess, impulse that Jesus had, and he was compassionate. And so, he was also empathetic. So understanding the reality of collective trauma should enable us to have a stronger drive when it comes to empathy. It's going to enable us to address deep-seated fears and mistrust that the people that we're trying to help have when they look at us, when they see us coming. Particularly the 4 key trauma responses of suspicion, solidarity, superiority, and significance. If we can think about our help in relationship to those things that they're probably feeling in some way, then it's going to help us form the way that we advocate for them more holistically. Then rejection of superiority complex. Christian missionaries have often exhibited a sense of cultural and religious superiority, and that alienates local populations from them. And it also reinforces kind of an anti-Christian sentiment, like Christians are only about themselves, or Christians just want to change us, or whatever it is. Christians wishing to be a stronger advocate community, we have to reject any idea of superiority that we have, and instead approach the community that we're trying to serve. We want to approach them as equals. We want to approach them in humility, attempting to understand, not making assumptions about what we think we know about them. So as Christian advocates, we ought to focus on mutual respect, dialogue, so that we can build trust and build transparent relationships. So they know who we are, so that they can trust us and we can help. So another element is building solidarity and trust. The solidarity among persecuted groups often led to a resistance against external influences. So that includes missionaries or others trying to help them. Advocates should work to build trust with local communities. They have to show genuine support for their struggles. So whether those struggles are real or not real, it's not necessarily for us to say, yeah, your facts aren't all quite right, right? So maybe they have a perception that maybe we disagree with. We don't have to agree or disagree from the outset. We can come alongside them and help them and support them and let them know that they're seen without affirming every single thing that they say. And that's an important thing for us to remember as we advocate for people. We don't have to agree with everything that the person thinks in order to be their friend, in order to be their support, to love them well like Jesus loves us. So building solidarity and trust, and then recognition of social memory dynamics. We have to remember that those things are at play. Collective memories are shaped by past traumas. They're shaped by political upheaval, social change, and oftentimes this is what leads to the rewriting of history in the community, right? Christians, we must recognize and respect the fluid nature of collective memory. engaging with communities in a way that acknowledges that their past experiences, they matter and they're significant. And that's driving a lot of the way that they think about their own worldview. And so we're coming into this not making assumptions based on what we think we know about them, but trying to learn from them from a humble posture so that we can hear them, see them, and then support them and encourage them, and maybe give them tools that would help to empower them to speak out for themselves or to be able to stand up for themselves. And all of it is done because we're walking in the way of Jesus. We're caring about the people that he cares about. All of it's focused on what he's doing in the world to bring about restoration and reconciliation through his work at the cross and through his resurrection.
So good. So good. Thank you so much for that. We've had a packed episode. This has been a lot of really, really helpful discussion. I think as we kind of begin to close this episode out and wrap up, I want to just share a few takeaways that I think I've gained from our conversation today. The first is that empowerment means helping others to help themselves, not just treating them as inferior, and then treating them in ways which primarily benefit the beneficiary, but in ways that are good for them, that benefit them instead. Number two is that history teaches us that disrespect and superiority complexes and dismissive attitudes are big dangers and big red flags. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect." So again, there's that reminder of gentleness and respect. The way that we do something matters so much and can be the make it or break it thing. The next thing, number 3, history also teaches us that history matters, and it's important to listen well to someone's experiences before advocating for them. You shared a lot with us about social memory and collective memory, collective trauma, what that actually means for a community and what it means for someone coming into a community trying to help. We really have to be aware of those things. Reminded of James 1:19, that every person should be slow to speak, quick to listen, and slow to anger. I remember especially what you said just now about listening, how important it is to not come in with our message, to not come in trying to say all these things, but to come in and just listen. I think at one point in a previous episode, you mentioned the ministry of presence. Ministry of presence, the ministry of listening. It's so overlooked and so important. And then finally, number 4, ultimately, Christian advocates should seek to be trustworthy people who speak the truth and love others well. So really, really powerful takeaways. In this episode, we spent a lot of time talking about the history of the Middle East. Over the next few episodes, we will start talking more about a particular group that Passages cares about deeply, and that's the Jewish people. We'll discuss why the Jewish people matter, what their experience has been actually recently, at the time that this podcast is being filmed and recorded, and how Christians should advocate for them. So we're excited to finish this season strong, and we're excited to talk more about, again, the practical steps of what Christian advocacy, Christians standing for what's right and good, and caring for others, what that actually looks like. So thank you, Luke, for joining us. We'll see you again in the next episode. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Discover Your Roots. For more resources, check out the links in the show notes and follow us on Instagram at Passages Israel. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.